Good evening to all of you. Good morning on my end. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm really excited to talk to you all, and thanks especially Yotam for having me. Yotam says I have a very big personality. I actually think everybody has a very big personality, and it's just code for he's very loud, but I'll take it. It's accurate. And it's really wonderful to see all of you, but I actually can't see you while my screen is being screen shared. So I totally invite you to use the Zoom chat to post ideas and comments, and I'll kind of look at them while y'all are in the breakout rooms and everything like that, but I won't see them while we're actually going here. I appreciate that most of the folks in the audience are multilingual. I apologize that I will be giving the talk in English. I am what I describe as tragically monolingual. Between my parents, they speak 8 languages and I speak just this one, but I like to think I speak it well. But we'll see. So welcome. I'm Suraj Uttamchandani. I use he, him, his pronouns. And as Yotam said, I am a visiting research scientist at the School of Ed at Indiana University in the United States. And today I really want to think about equity in research on learning with technology. I'm really interested in equity and learning, but I think the technology piece is a newer part of my thinking. And so that's what I really want to think through today with all of you is how does technology support, factor in, hinder? What role does it play as we think about educational equity? So today I'm thinking about equity, just broadly, social justice and so on. And I'm thinking about learning in the ways that we think about it in the learning sciences. And then I'm thinking about technology. And I'm trying to realize that at the intersection of some of these ideas is some really, really deep work. So for example, at the intersection of learning and technology, there's some really wonderful work by the computer-supported collaborative learning community. At the intersection of equity and technology, we've seen a rise of some really interesting work in terms of critical information studies, some of which I'll highlight later in this talk. And lately, there's been a really increased attention to the political and ethical dimensions of learning in the learning sciences or in the critical learning sciences. And so we're seeing at each of the intersections of 2 of these things, some really powerful ideas surfacing. And what I'd like to do today is see if there's something to think about at the intersection of all 3. Now, of course, there's lots of great ideas at the intersection of all 3 of these, but what I'm going for today is some kind of framework or way of thinking coherently at this intersection, and perhaps thinking towards a research agenda for educational technology researchers that foregrounds equity. What might such a research agenda look like, and are we at the point where we could carve one out? So today I'm going to offer you kind of a guided tour of this Venn diagram. We'll walk through equity, I'll think about learning and equity, and then we'll kind of pause to think through technology together. And then I'll walk through some of how I'm thinking about technology, and we can see if we can converge on this green X, which, spoiler alert, we won't be able to, but maybe we'll be able to have some good discussion about it. So why equity? Why equity at all? Well, my answer to that is read the news. Open any newspaper anywhere in the world, and you will be quite inundated with some tragedies, and a really wide variety of them in really worldwide contexts. And when I see those kinds of things, I think when I was young, I really thought education was the answer. And I didn't really know what that meant, but I really felt like when I see these horrible things, if I could just contribute to education, educational research, and educational technology, and so on, that I would somehow solve these equity problems. But what I realized as I went through my own research trajectory was that unless you foreground equity in your designs, it doesn't come naturally. And so why equity? Well, if we want to have our research, our technology, and our designs speak back to social issues in ways that help people and improve quality of life in equitable ways, then we need to attend to equity. So that's all I'll say about why equity matters. Oh, wait, no, I have a whole nother slide on why equity matters. So I'll say a little bit more about it. Why equity when we think about research on learning and technology? One is that equity helps us think about the question of why are we doing something? What is the goal of such an innovation or research program? Who is it designed to help? And for whom does it actually work? Who are the learners who actually benefit from the innovation and the thinking? And I think about these as criteria for rigor. Like a study might be made more rigorous, not if it speaks to more people, but if it has a better and clearer picture of under what circumstances it works, for whom, and with its goals in mind. If those things are articulated more clearly, I think you wind up with a more rigorous study. And finally, I think inequity is not somewhere else. It's always present in environments. And if we don't attend to inequity, we wind up reinscribing inequity. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so this whole time I've just been using the word equity without any clear definition. And so I invite you to just take 15 seconds, 30 seconds, feel free to throw your answers in the chat. When you hear the word equity, what words come to mind for you? I'll just give us 30 seconds of thinking time here. So when you hear the word equity, what words come to mind for you? You're welcome to put them in the chat or just think about this in your head. Yeah, I'm seeing opportunities, needs, equal, silencing, division, democracy, fairness, transparency, injustice. Yes, truly quite a wide collection of words come to mind for us. So these were just the first 20 or so that, oh, what's happening now? These are just the first 20 or so that I thought of. When I think of equity, I think of words like partnership, friendship, anti-racism, participation, love, justice, fairness, unbiased, freedom, inclusion, diversity. And so we can see that equity is actually a really imprecise term. It captures a lot of different things that maybe are at cross purposes. And so I actually am not going to define equity much more precisely in this talk, but I say for the moment, let's use a really wide range of definitions for equity. So for the moment, whatever you're thinking about as equity is good enough. I want to highlight just a few dimensions of what I'm thinking about when I think about equity in learning that are going to be really relevant for helping us think about learning technologies. But of course, we could do a whole course on equity, and we're not going to. We're just going to do a few minutes on it. So these are just a few of the ideas that I think are really important when we think about equity. I find it really productive to think about equity as a stance or a lens, as a way of looking at a problem or a technology or a design or the world. So equity is not necessarily a goal to me. It's not someplace you can get. It's rather a position that you can take. You can take an equity lens to an issue. And thinking about equity in this way, I find very, very productive because it saves you from having to think that you've achieved equity, and it always puts you in a learning posture where you're in conversation and in dialogue with others. So I like to think about equity as a stance or lens. I think equity is multi-level. So of course it has to do with government and legislation, which I think is often how we think about political issues. It has to do, of course, with power and who in the room has power and what kind of power structures afford or constrain what people do. But it's also interpersonal. Equity has to do with how we behave towards one another, how we treat one another on the individual level. And so equity is a multi-level issue to me. Equity is fundamentally political, which I alluded to before, and I think this is particularly important because when you live in an inequitable society, without an equity lens, we tend to reinscribe inequities. We make them more entrenched. We make them harder to combat if we design without thinking about equity. And Thomas Philip and Pratham Sengupta just put out an article in the Journal of the Learning Sciences that expressed this idea quite nicely. They write, to be abundantly clear, theories of learning that remain silent about their socio-political contexts and consequences are equally political as they reify existing inequities and injustices. And so this turn in the learning sciences helps us understand that no theories of learning are apolitical or non-political. There's no such thing as a non-political theory of learning. And if we accept that, which, I invite you to be skeptical about for the moment, but if you accept that, then we should embrace the political dimensions of our thinking and start more explicitly asking equity kinds of questions. Importantly for this group, and this is partially why I'm really excited to hear from y'all today, I think equity is a global problem It is not a problem that is just situated in the United States, even though some of dominant equity discourses are foregrounding North America. People have talked about the so-called weird problem in psychology, in which psychological studies are predominantly taking place in Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. And those kinds of studies are assumed to generalize across the world in ways that are really problematic and not likely to take place. Lately, I've been doing some work with Vishesh Kumar, Gayatri Jayatartha, and Deborah Datta, thinking with the South Asian Learning Sciences Research Collective, whose logo you see here. And that kind of work has been about thinking about the learning sciences in South Asian and more specifically Indian contexts. And as we do that kind of work, we realize that there are lots of forms of inequity and repair that are not visible if you center Europe and North America. So for example, we've been thinking really hard about caste discrimination. Caste is a really large problem in India and a really entrenched problem, and one that would be invisibilized if you didn't have the culturally specific ways of thinking about equity and inequity. And so looking towards the West is not in itself inequitable, and looking towards the global South is not in itself equitable. But taking this broader lens to equity can be really powerful for helping us see things that we otherwise would not see. I also want to really emphasize that equity is multi-voiced. It has to do with multivocality and polyvocality. How many people are in the conversation? How are their views attended to? How is difference treated? And so really, really wonderful work in the learning sciences around research practice partnerships, community-based research, thinking with other stakeholders is, I think, a powerful move towards equity because it diversifies the conversation. Roseberry, Ogonowski, Deshino, and Warren argue that heterogeneity and diversity is fundamental to learning. And I think that's a really powerful idea because it helps us see that there are always going to be differences in learning environments, differences among how people think about things and differences in who people are and what they value. The question is, how do we view difference? If we can position difference as a resource and as something powerful that can support new forms of learning, then we have already made a really, really powerful equity move. And so that brings me to arguably my final point on equity broadly, which is that equity itself is always going to be multi-voiced and heterogeneous. So when we were posting those words about what equity means to us or what comes to mind when we think about equity, some of those things are going to be at cross purposes. Tuck and Yang write about this ethic of incommensurability, this idea that we can collaborate for a time together, even while anticipating that our pathways toward enacting liberation will diverge. Incommensurability means that we cannot judge each other's justice projects by the same standard, but we can come to understand the gap between our viewpoints and thus work together in contingent collaboration. Or as Audre Lorde puts it, we do not have to become each other in order to work together. I think it's really, really important that equity discourses do not punish some people and raise other people up because we're not thinking in the same way. The idea that equity foregrounds difference as a resource is also important in how people are thinking about and working towards equity. And so I think I shall stop there on equity generally and now see what kinds of connections we can make towards learning and the learning sciences. So in my Venn diagram, we're now entering this learning equity overlap. Like I said, that's not everything that needs to be said about equity, but I think that raises for us some of the key ideas that are going to help us think about what that means for learning and the learning sciences. So we can think about learning in a variety of ways. Some of the most common ways are thinking about learning as a cognitive shift or a change in what individuals know, think, and how they behave. Learning is enculturation and shifts in how people participate in communities and how people think together and work together. And then lately, in the tradition of social design experiments by Chris Gutierrez, Susan Giroux, and others, we're thinking about learning as future organizing, or the process by which people arrange and rearrange possible futures. And these metaphors for learning, I argue, are all quite powerful, and each of them has a lot to offer equity conversations. So, for our purposes, I won't be picking just one of these metaphors. I invite you to think about learning however you're thinking about learning will work, I think, for what I'm about to say. So, now the question at hand is, what do all of those equity things that I've been saying have to do with learning? And how can we think about the relationship between learning and equity? And I would argue that given how many different ways I've offered for thinking about equity and how many different ways I've offered for thinking about learning, it seems like there's chaos and that basically every project could possibly be a learning equity project. That's not going to work. We need it to be the case that some things are identifiable as equity learning projects. And so this was a really big problem for me early on in my dissertation work, was thinking about I really care about research practice partnerships. I really care about work that diversifies who can participate in science and technology and mathematics. I really care about work where youth are actually taking on activist identities. And I understand all of this work as having a long history in the learning sciences and having a role to play in equity discourses. But I don't know that the same way of thinking about equity and the same way of thinking about learning is being used. And so I started to really think, so how do equity and learning go together? And I think it can be summarized in kind of two big ideas that have been really helpful for me to think about this learning and equity relationship. Equity in learning and learning towards equity. And now I'll talk about each of those in a little bit of detail. So when I think about equity in learning, I'm thinking, how can we make the powerful learning environments that we think about in the learning sciences available to everyone? How can we kind of scale up or scale out our big ideas from the learning sciences? So here I'm thinking about research that broadens participation either in particular disciplines or particular fields and seeks to expand whose voices are represented in these disciplinary conversations. I'm thinking about research that centers scale. It says, who can access this learning environment? How can we make sure that this technology, this design is accessible to the most learners possible? And I think about learning that is ambitious. It says, how can we make sure that the learning environments that students encounter foster dialogue, inquiry, problem-based learning, ambitious learning practices, right? So I think a really classic kind of straightforward example is the work of Kylie Pepler and colleagues, whose ideas around e-textiles were that using sewing circuits such that conductive thread was used to sew together batteries and lights could help a wider variety of youth think about electricity and circuitry. And in so doing, broaden participation in science. And I think that project is a really classic kind of project in the learning sciences. There's a lot of work that similarly seeks to expand disciplines through really thoughtful and historicized and situated designs. And so I'm really excited about equity in learning. I'm really excited about the idea of saying for any given learning environment, how can we make sure that learning environment is equitable on its own terms in its own internal logic? But then I also think it's important to say, what do learning environments have to do with larger social equity? And how can learning environments support equity broadly? So such a tradition would ask the question, in what ways is learning in this space likely to contribute to a moral, ethical, and just society? And here I'm thinking about research that centers learning about equity, by which I mean like youth or learners engage in conversations about social issues, equity issues, and research that reclaims intellectual life and potential. And let me explain what I mean by that. Here I'm thinking about research that explicitly works against deficit traditions that argue that particular kinds of people can only think or participate in learning in really constrained ways. And instead, that kind of work seeks to better understand the really rich learning that already exists in large varieties of communities. A really classic example of that latter one would be Mike Rose's work, The Working Life of a Waitress, in which he does an ethnographic study with waitresses in restaurants and points to how rich the learning, cognition, and practices in the restaurant environment are for waitresses who are, at least in the United States, often treated without dignity and assumed to not be terribly intellectually capable. And so that kind of research seeks to powerfully intervene with these discourses that circumscribe people and instead reclaim the deep intellect and the deep potential of all people. In my dissertation, I thought a lot about how LGBTQ plus, lesbian, gay, transgender, queer, bisexual, asexual, intersex, and other sexual and gender minority youth worked against these kinds of deficit traditions to actively present to teachers and other stakeholders on how to work with LGBTQ plus youth. And as they did that, they learned about the histories of LGBTQ plus youth. They learned about how to talk to and work with teachers. And they started to participate in their communities in really powerful ways. I just want to share this comic because I think it's such a delight. Joe Curnow, Tanner Vea, and Andrew Cohan have put out these Learning to Engage comics, which is a freely accessible comic book series that seeks to translate some learning sciences research on civic engagement into comic book form. And I can't take any of the credit for how cute it is because I don't know how to draw and I can't draw to save my life. But do, if you get the chance, check out those comics. They really are a delight. So in summary, I'm trying to think really hard about if we have all these different ways to think about equity and all these different ways to think about learning in the learning sciences, how can we think coherently at their intersection? And for me, it's really productive to narrow that down to more or less two large traditions that I think are really useful thought experiments and offer us a series of questions that we can ask about our own learning environments that can productively make sure that we're thinking towards and designing for equity. That's the idea of equity in learning, which assumes that equity is about access and equitable opportunities to participate, and believes that social change takes place when policies shift, when access improves, when more people are participating in particular places. And then learning as equity, which assumes that social change happens when people's fundamental dignity is nourished and when people engage in political education and political activism. And so that leaves us with more or less two, although there's many more or less two questions that we can always be asking ourselves as we design for equitable learning environments. How can we make the deep learning we see or design available to everyone? And in what ways is that learning likely to contribute to a moral, ethical, and just society? Okay, so we got the equity and the learning and maybe the intersection a little bit. Maybe we're there. And now, for no reason at all, although I'll come back to this, for no reason at all, let's throw in technology and see what technology has to do with it. So I'm trying to get to that green X. And so this has been our guided tour so far. So my preliminary answers, if you asked me, why should I care about technology? Well, I don't know that you should, but if I were to argue that we should, I'm thinking about the idea that technology development seems to be happening whether we like it or not. There seems to be an assumption that technology has a role to play in solving social problems. And I feel like I can agree with that to some degree. It probably has some role to play in social problems. But one thing that I think is really powerful about technology is it seems to scale faster than other things. Like, for example, educational technology seems to become something that more people use more quickly than, let's say, a particular approach to learning or a particular pedagogy like problem-based learning. So I think if we can be really deliberate about our technology designs, we might be able to scale lots of other things as we scale up technology. For example, if we have a piece of technology that supports teachers and students in building relationships with one another, and we scale out that technology, what we've actually scaled out is a relational way of being with one another. And so I'm thinking, like, can we be really clever about how we scale up and scale out technology? Here I'm thinking with Aisha Bindavala, Dr. Krista Glazewski, Dr. Cindy Mello-Silver, Dr. Chris Hoadley, and Josh Quicker have been some of my thinking partners. I myself am not I don't know that much about technology, but I try and think really hard about equity learning and technology. And so these folks have really helped me do that. So Chris Hoadley and I were thinking about what are the upcoming tech trends? What are some of the big ideas that are happening in the world of cyber learning and technology? And we identified these kind of four big things that are going to happen or we think are already happening in the technology arena in the last few years and in the next few. Total data, lots and lots of data that learners are producing, that people are producing, data that seems to measure all sorts of things at all times. Artificial intelligence and other algorithms for processing big data. So that total data gets processed It gets sent back to you, it gets interpreted, it makes recommendations, and things like that. Retina grade experiences, by which we mean experiences of simulated environments and virtual environments that are so sharp, so powerful in terms of their sensory presentation that they might even be indistinguishable from reality. Let's hope not, because that seems like it's going to cause some trouble. And then increasing ubiquity of technology, but importantly with digital divides. Yes, I think it's fair to say that there is more technology. It seems to be happening, but that technology doesn't seem to be distributed equally. And so new kinds of digital divides are emerging. So I'm thinking about these upcoming tech trends and their implications for learning and education. And I want to briefly offer kind of a tour of some of the really useful work happening at the intersection of technology and learning so that we can bring some of that equity lens to it. So just quite briefly, a few of the really fascinating stuff happening in the educational technology sphere are immersive learning environments and computer-supported collaborative learning environments. For example, what you see here is a picture from a science inquiry problem-based learning game called Crystal Island, in which middle school science students work together in this video game to engage in inquiry about why fish are dying. Actually, the screenshot is about, it's a slightly different version about viruses, which is a little bit too topical for my taste for the moment. So the version we are working on now is about fish and why fish are dying. And so these kinds of environments allow for inquiry. They allow teachers to scaffold and support inquiry in ways that are really exciting to learners and help us think in really novel ways about how to support learners in scientific inquiry, collecting data, some of these activities that are really high load in non-technologically mediated contexts, but that technology can help us develop some of those practices. And that's just one example of a computer-supported collaborative learning environment. Another big thing that is happening in the learning sciences world around technology is learning analytics. Just this idea that processing some of that total data, that huge trace that learners are giving off, can be really productive for helping us think about how to guide learners in ways that are positive to them. I'm a little bit worried about learning analytics, and I may or may not return to that later, but I do think it's worth pointing to as one of the large trends that is happening. And then in the technology and learning world, we're seeing some really fun digital cultures. I actually don't think that these are new. When I was a kid not that long ago, we were on MySpace. Remember MySpace? I don't know if y'all had MySpace. It wasn't that good. It's not worth remembering, but we had MySpace. We had AOL Instant Messenger, we had MSN and Google Talk. And nowadays, kids these days have TikTok, and they seem to be very good at it. And TikTok is definitely a site that is not special in its technology scale out. And by that, I mean the kinds of things people are doing on TikTok are things that people have done on other social media. But at the current moment, it seems to be a really important platform for youth engaging in political education, political activism, organizing, and particular kinds of affinity learning and affinity groups. At this point, let me just show you a TikTok just in case we could benefit from an example. This is a TikTok that somebody made about learning right now, about their educational experience right now.
So recently, I wrote an article, and I reached out to a lot of people, including my school. So recently, I wrote an article, and I reached out to a lot of people, including my school's meme page, Reddit, and Twitter. And I got a lot of responses. Everyone felt like they were alone. It was hard for them to study, to concentrate. A lot of them felt like dropping out. Moreover, they just felt like no one was listening. Their professors didn't care. And a lot of us are struggling with our mental health and balancing the time between work and school during a pandemic. It just feels like there's no resources and we're doing the best that we can. We're scared. I even interviewed someone who takes their classes at 3 a.m. because there wasn't accommodation for them to take their classes in a different country. Our mental health needs to be addressed, or people are going to drop out. We need to be accommodated.
So that is a TikTok from a student journalist in California. about their current educational experience. And I just wanted to point to that because we're seeing youth use TikTok as a place to find like minded people, to engage in activism or educative kinds of work. And that kind of digital culture building and affinity space building is something that the learning sciences has had a lot of success in studying. Youth digital culture and people's digital culture, for example, in the work of the Connected Learning Initiative. So all that to say, we've got a few really nice examples at the intersection of learning and technology that our fields have really been quite thoughtful about designing and theorizing. And now we kind of want to bring in that equity lens. So let's think about technology and equity together. Here's an example of a case study that I think is quite powerful, remote proctoring. So if you're not familiar with remote proctoring, the idea is if you are taking a class at home, you can use this kind of software that video records you while you are taking an exam on your computer. And the idea is that the software can basically detect if you're cheating. And in this way, it replicates the idea of a face-to-face proctored exam. And I think this is a really good example for us to think with as educational technology researchers because it exhibits some of those properties that I identified as some of these big tech trends. So remote proctoring is based on lots of data. It looks at your face, it looks at your movements, it detects sound. So it's really collecting a lot of data. And then it engages in algorithmic computation to flag you as cheating or to tell your professor that you have done something wrong. And it somehow processes all of that data through an algorithmic form. And remote proctoring is something that, this is anecdotal, but as far as I can tell, it has been scaled out quite widely during this COVID pandemic as faculty, teachers, and so on rush to replace some of their existing pedagogies in ways that work for remote instruction. And so we have remote proctoring as a really nice case study of a technology that is scaled up and scaled out and exhibits some of these things that we're seeing in tech trends. However, I'm about to attack remote proctoring. Remote proctoring doesn't seem to be working in quite the ways that we would dream that it would. So lots of people have reported, and especially students have reported, that the technology is constantly telling them that they cheated when they didn't. It's constantly telling their faculty that they cheated when they didn't, that students have had to make sure that they have a bottle because they can't get up to use the bathroom, that if they're wearing a hijab or another headscarf, the remote proctoring system might flag them as cheating because you're supposed to not have anything on your head because somehow, I guess, hats are cheating. I don't fully understand the idea there, but remote proctoring seems to actually be really, really problematic. And I think in addition to the algorithm possibly not working, it's highly stressful for students. Students are just like not having a good time. They're not excited about remote proctoring. And it's really kind of subpoenas their dignity. And so if I'm thinking about remote proctoring in this way, I'm thinking with Audrey Waters, who writes, how much of ed tech is designed by those who imagine students as cheats or criminals, as deficient or negligent? Like, what is our imagination when we design some of these technologies? What are we assuming about students and their natural behaviors and what we're trying to curtail, rather than what we're trying to allow? Like, what might we allow differently? And I think remote proctoring is a really wonderful example of something the learning sciences is well positioned to argue against and think through in really powerful ways. So the whole point of remote proctoring is that it's supposed to support these like non-cheating assessments, right? But learning scientists have really strong opinions about, if you ever talk to a learning scientist about assessment, you'll know learning scientists have really strong opinions about assessment and whether or not such assessments are actually the best or let alone the only way to measure learning. There are, of course, methodological issues associated with how that algorithm works and what we're assuming about the data being collected. Really importantly, students don't seem to have a choice, right? They're not often put in a position where they can opt out of this remote proctoring environment or say, no thanks. Faculty will tend to fail them. And so this is a place where I want to bring those equity lenses, those equity learning lenses to bear. So if I'm thinking about equity in learning, I'm thinking about how this learning environment seems to be discriminatory. There are some people for whom it's harder than others. It seems to not necessarily allow people to bring their full selves or to have their dignity nourished in the learning environment. They're kind of in this position that is assuming them to be cheaters. And then if I think about learning towards equity, I ask the question, so what about this remote proctoring environment brings us closer to a more moral, ethical, or just society? And I personally come up short. I'm having a lot of trouble thinking about that. So, I feel like somewhere in this talk I had to say something really rude about some educational technology. And so here it was. There it is. There's some really, really wonderful work by Sophia Noble and others around how these algorithms that are based on these systems that these systems are based on tend to be racist, problematic, or otherwise inequitable. And so Arij Mawasi and colleagues wrote about some of the big challenges in learning environments mediated by educational technology with regard to equity. They pointed to three really, really fruitful ways for thinking about how we might ameliorate some of these challenges. The first is the neutrality facade, the assumption that technology is totally neutral and that it doesn't inscribe particular values of particular people. So that's not true, of course. So we should make sure that we're thinking about educational technology as not neutral. They point to this new digital divide, and they say new digital divide because they're pointing to not only the divide in access to what technologies people have, but also how technologies are used differently with different populations, how these surveillance technologies are used more with people who are assumed to be criminal, which often falls alongside racist lines or other kinds of inequitable lines, and the openness paradox. And they argue that there's this idea that simply opening up technology or making technology more accessible is automatically a move towards equity. But if we think about so-called open technologies like Facebook, we know that those things have actually also supported really problematic scale-ups and scale-outs of really radical views that constrain equity. Okay, so that's all sort of a downer, and you might be tempted to think that I hate technology, and you wouldn't be totally wrong. But there's actually some wonderful, really powerful examples that can help us think about an alternative, how technology can support collectivity. So for example, if you're familiar with Hypothesis or other social annotation softwares, this is when you might, for example, read an article, and together you can annotate the article in real time and see what other people are thinking about. So in this study by Remy Kalir and Antero Garcia, we're seeing educators engage in what they call civic writing or social annotation around articles about equity and learning. And in doing so, we see how the technology allows particular kinds of conversations across geographic boundaries to take place in ways that are clearly moving us towards dialogue and equity. Another wonderful example from Slackman and Schwartz, wherever you go, you will be a polis. They did this really, really fascinating study of discussions in, I think, a middle school classroom. And they pointed to how these discussions and their spatial arrangement allowed for new kinds of conversation. So in contrast to a system like a discussion board where all conversations take place linearly, instead we see this platform, Argonaut, where conversations can be arranged in different forms with different sizes of contributions, and students have agency to place their contributions in particular ways and expand the size of their contributions. And the authors did this really fascinating example of how that spatiality allowed students to engage in political education and civic discourse in really powerful new ways that I would argue were probably not made possible without the technology. So I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer in the sense that I think there are some really powerful examples of how we can think at the intersection of learning, technology, and equity. But I really want us to see if we can come up with a clear picture of when technology is more like these examples and when technology is more like remote proctoring, and how we can kind of separate those things in a coherent and deep way. And of course, I welcome disagreement if you think that these examples are being treated unfairly. I welcome that conversation. And so I'm left trying to converge on that beautiful green X. And I just thought, let me think a little bit with some whimsy, and I hope that we can continue this as we move into the Q&A. Let me think about some of the future threads for technology equity and learning that might be really exciting, that might together form a research agenda or a theoretical framework. I'm thinking about social media discourse spread. I'm thinking a lot about TikTok. That seems like a place where we can really make some headway as learning scientists. What is it that people learn when they engage in these larger social media spreads? I don't actually think that social media discourse spread is itself equitable because we often see really inequitable ideas scale out through social media. Um, Not to be topical, but the United States election really brings this to the forefront. But so there's something there. I'm really thinking about more fun and joyous learning environments. And in fairness, this might be because I recently bought Mario Kart. And if you're not familiar with Mario Kart, it's like a video game where you just like race around in carts with Nintendo characters, and there's a lot of bananas. And as I play it, I just think like it's just so whimsical, and it makes me feel like a kid again. And so I don't bring up that example to say that gamification should be a really important part of our agenda moving forward, but more than that, sense of joy, whimsy, fun, immersion seems like something we can actually start to foreground in our conversations about technology. How can technology bring about that sense of intimacy, whimsy, joy that is really fundamental to thinking about equity? I also think that the learning sciences would really benefit from thinking about technologies that are really intentionally not scaled out. I think often in our conversations about technology, we assume that eventually that technology will scale or move to a different environment. And in fact, sometimes you can critique learning scientists for insufficiently attending to that, for focusing too much on things that are so locally situated. But I also think it's really important to say, if we're trying to solve local problems without scale, what might change about how we think about technology? Now, in fairness, I'm the one who said that technology should be electronics for the purposes of our discussion. But now at this point, I think it's also really important for us to expand our view of technology. So for example, and Tom, I feel like you were telling me about these future learning spaces at your university, that this talk would probably be in one of them if we weren't living in these times. So similar kinds of things happening at my university where these active learning spaces are really interested in new organizations of tables and chairs that might prompt new kinds of learning. And I actually think those are really, really powerful technologies that we should center when we think about technology supported learning and educational technology. Those things, the simple changing of furniture in a room, can be more consequential for the kinds of things that students do in that space than any amount of computer programs might be. And so I'm really excited about broadening the idea of technology to think about that. I care a lot about ambitious learning practices. I sort of mentioned this earlier. So how can we foreground the role of technology in supporting dialogue, problem-based learning, inquiry, disciplinary identification, some of these bigger things. So in other words, what role does technology play in actually disrupting behaviorist and rote models of learning? And so that leaves me thinking, okay, if I'm trying to come up with either a coherent framework or a coherent research agenda, maybe it makes sense to talk about equity in technology and technology towards equity, which is similar to what I did with learning, equity and learning towards equity. But then, so where's the learning piece? I don't really want to say equity and technology for learning, learning technologies for equity, but maybe there is something really rich at this intersection that could be powerful. Or maybe this is, maybe we're thinking about this problem the wrong way. Maybe it makes sense to think about technology only in the context of equity or only in the context of learning and still be thinking at that intersection. So that's kind of where I feel like a dialogue would be really productive to think about that green X, that intersection. Is there something really powerful and deep at that intersection? Is there a research agenda or theory? Or are we thinking about this problem in the wrong way as we think about designing for educational technology in ways that can support increases in quality of life, increases in equity for a large group of people? So I'll go ahead and kind of, oh, no, just kidding. I have one final thought apparently. And so at that point, I think it's really important to turn that equity lens in on our own field and our own research. Think about that equity mirror. When we look back on what we are doing, how are we engaging in equitable practices as we organize our research and as we organize our field? Now I think that's my piece. So I had a calculus teacher in high school, one of my favorite teachers, and anytime she'd put any calculus on the board, she would stop and she would say questions, comments, cries of outrage. And so I like to think of those as the three ways you could potentially respond to anything that's been said. So at this point, I'd like to thank you again. Thanks again, Yotam, for having me. Thank you all for joining me this evening. And I welcome your questions, comments, and cries of outrage. I think Yotam is going to tell us a little bit about how to organize this next part of the Q&A. But one more time, I'm Suraj Uttamchandani. It's a pleasure being with you this evening.
I hope for all of the groups that gave you guys a chance to think about some of the questions. These are big and deep ideas, and it's not always easy to come up with a good question. But is there anyone that wants to ask a question? And if so, please just maybe raise your hand with the reactions. It'll be easier for me to find you here. Just not everyone at the same time, because then I won't know who to choose. All right, Guy, I see you're clapping. Did you mean to raise your hand, Guy?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to put you on spotlight, and please go ahead and ask the question.
Okay. So I wanted to know, like, if there's anything special that you can put in the same place that you asked us, like between technology, equity, and education. Like, do you see anything special that can fit there?
Thank you for that question. I don't know. I don't know if I'm thinking about this the right way. Like, I don't know if actually these three things, equity, technology, and learning, are all the same kind of thing. Like, if they all belong on equal footing. But I feel like the idea of broadening out what technology is could be part of how we do this. Like, if we think about technology as infrastructure, for example, is something that some people are doing in the learning sciences, or particular, yeah, I think infrastructure is the right idea. I don't know. Do you have anything you want to throw in?
I don't know. I know that we spoke, like, in the group about the fact that, like, before we ask ourselves about the equity in learning about technology, we should ask ourselves about the equity in everyday life. Same goes, like, for me being a teacher. Some of the experience is like not all the children come from the same houses and with the same, how can I say, it's privileges. So I think it's important to look at the part of equity in a very basis manner before we approach and ask this question.
Right. I really appreciate that point, and I think it highlights that equity is something that we can think about in. Oh, you spotlighted my video. Oh, Lord. Equity is something that we can think about in kind of cycles. So I think it's right that we should think about equity broadly in our everyday life. And I think if we use our research as a site to expand our thinking about equity, that's also good. And I think if we reflect on ourselves and our own lives and our own identities, that's also part of equity. And I feel like as we move across those different things in this cycle, we can engage in really powerful conversations and moves. But I also think, like, I have been very helped out by thinking about equity as a stance. So it's not a place you're trying to get to. It's an orientation that you take, and you can always take it even when it's uncomfortable or even when you don't yet know what you're talking about, because we can treat the equity stance as a stance that tells you what questions to ask rather than what questions to answer. So I appreciate that. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Do we have another question?
I have a question.
Yes, Adam.
So my question is, what are the costs, if they exist, in terms of research when you try to be equitable?
What an interesting question. One thing that I feel very strongly about is that equitable research takes time. And so time is one of those things that I think is a cost. And I say time, like, for example, if you're doing partnership work or stakeholder work, anybody who's done that work can tell you that everything takes like 3 or 4 times as long because you're engaging in these deliberate conversations around particular designs or particular moves. And I think we need to free ourselves with the idea that there is a right timeline for research. So for example, learning analytics is a really wonderful example of a place where lots of data is being produced and you could perhaps analyze it quickly. But that doesn't mean that all research needs to happen on that timeline. Like different people can have different timelines, and we have to accept that equitable research takes a longer time. So that's perhaps one cost. But I would say there's a great mental cost to trying to make one research project or one research paper solve equity. That's a lost cause. But I think we're freed of some of those costs if we understand ourselves to be participating in a larger project across multiple fields. Like if we think I'm trying to solve equity, you're doomed for failure. But if you think I'm trying to contribute to the way that the learning sciences or the way that this community is trying to work towards greater equity, then you're freed of some of those costs. I feel like when I think of cost, I think of money, and off the top of my head, I can't think of an obvious way that there's a monetary cost for taking on equity, but perhaps there is, and I can think more about that. Do you want to comment back or have anything that you want to throw into the mix?
Well, I was wondering whether, sometimes when we do research in educational technology and all kinds of stuff like that, then we work with populations that have access to those things, right? Or we work with all kinds of innovative programs that, once again, not everyone has access to. So if you try to make those, like that research, more equitable, something that you can generalize to more populations, something that more populations have access to and can use, then you might not be able to use some of those technologies. But I guess when I think about your answer in terms of looking at it as not every single research project that one takes upon himself needs to, solve equity, but you see yourself as like, you look at your research and think, okay, what can I do in my research in order to also make it more equitable? Then I guess that kind of answers the question to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point. And I think, like, I'm thinking about the work of Dylan Pare and others have designed this virtual reality simulation in which people who participate explore and think about their avatars with regard to their gender identity. And they've shown that with just a few people that they've done some of this work with, they've shown that it's a really powerful site for thinking about gender justice, LGBTQ plus equality, and so on. But it's this really deep virtual reality environment. And so I don't know that that's going to go scale up and we're going to solve things that way. But I still think of that as a really deep contribution to the equity conversation in educational technology, in showing us what is possible and in thinking about, like, are there conversations that we're having trouble having that technology can help us have? Because if somebody can show me that, can show me how technology can make somebody more comfortable in a conversation about equity, for example, then I think that even if that technology is really high monetary investment at this moment, you've shown us something that we can really study and think through and think about scale later on. And then, of course, there are other places where it's more appropriate to think right at the beginning, like maybe we shouldn't design this technology in such a way that it needs 9 iPads, 4 video cameras. And I mean, I think there is a place for that sometimes, but I think other times, you could say, are we setting ourselves up to never be able to really scale?
I see, thank you, Adam and Suraj. I see Callie has her hand up to represent her group, so putting the spotlight.
Hi, first of all, thank you for this wonderful talk. Really, we talked about so many things in our group, and you've really made us think about some important things, especially in this particular stressful era that we're now at. And one of the things we thought about, well, this is not really a question, it's more of a comment, but just I'd like to reiterate it with you. So the group I was in had Ira, Ya'ara, and Manar, and this is mostly what they were thinking. And we thought first that whether this type of research about equity, this combination of equity, technology, and learning is gaining more focus now in these days, and we were thinking that it should. But what also came up in our group is that to look at the bright side of things is that in this time when students are learning from distance, teachers and educators, some of them at least, seem to have they're more aware of how their students are feeling and are looking at them holistically. And maybe this is something that we should take back when we go back to face to be better aware of how our students are feeling right now. And so this is just something that came up in our group.
I love that point. Thank you for sharing that. I have two kind of responses. One is, I think that idea of looking for like the potential or the joy in this moment is really the right, I mean, actually joy feels like pushing it, but let's say potential and possibility in this moment is really a wonderful equity stance. And I think you're right. Like, I think we're able to start to attune to things that we weren't attuning to before. Like, one of my hopes would be that teachers have a much better appreciation of the diversity of home lives that their students have than they maybe did, and it was easier to ignore or not see when schooling was face to face, for example. So I really appreciate that idea, and I hope that we can carry some of the, like, one thing that's been happening in this time is I feel like we always open with a little bit more emotional intimacy and a little bit more check-in. Like when we start a meeting with, how are you? Like, it seems like for the first time, people actually want to know how you are, and it's okay if we spend lots of time on that. And I hope we carry that through, because that's always been necessary. I would argue that everything that's happening now has probably always been necessary, but now we're all appreciating it a bit more. So I agree with that. And then to the point that you were raising about, should all research be about equity? Yes, totally, in the sense that from my perspective, any research that isn't explicitly thinking towards equity is thinking towards inequity. And so I don't think there's anything but those two. I mean, actually, of course, I'm oversimplifying for the purposes of making a point, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's my talk. So I do think that yes, like all of us should be thinking about equity, but part of what I really hope happens is that we can think about ourselves as in dialogue with one another, so that you don't feel like you, the individual, need to systematically solve every problem, which is a completely lost cause, but rather that we're in this community, this dialogue, this stance. Thanks, it's good to see you.
You too.
Okay, well, we probably have time for one more question. I see Tal has a question, so Tal, go ahead.
I want to ask about the opposite forces. Can you recognize the anti-equity forces that operate in the edtech arena, something like business interest or maybe government policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Are you asking me to like name some of them or think through some of the?
Just can you recognize the main forces that work on the opposite direction?
Yeah, so for example, I think surveillance technology is a really important example of something that's going in the opposite direction. So we're thinking about how facial recognition technology, surveillance technologies are being used.
But excuse me, I don't ask about technology that that operate in the opposite direction in the total technology sphere, but in edtech, who is?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So I feel like in educational technology, I'm really worried about a theoretical technology and technology that is primarily behaviorist. And so I think, for example, about a technology that's very popular in the United States is Class Dojo, which is a technology that teachers can use to essentially give students, elementary students, points. And if you get more points, you're, you know, good. And if you get less points because you've behaved badly, you're sort of punished. And there's this game board, and you can see how you level up and up. And I'm not trying to attack that technology, because I also think that in my conversations with my teacher friends, this is the kind of technology that is really beloved by some of my teacher friends. And I'm thinking about a technology like that one as one that has done a much better job of thinking about what teachers need and what teachers like and what feels really like it's meeting teachers' needs. And yet, like, those kinds of technologies, I worry that they're either theoretical, and they don't understand. And I mean, with regard to learning theory, like, we have some really, really good learning theory. And I feel like there's not really a reason to be theoretical with regard to learning, or behaviorist, neo-behaviorist, in ways that I think are really problematic. I also think another example, for example, would be this remote proctoring technology. Whereas, like, going back to what Yael was saying, what if we took this moment to say, maybe instead of trying to replicate that testing environment, with no judgment about face-to-face testing, I'll just leave that be for a moment, but instead of trying to replicate it with technology, what if we took that as an opportunity to say, is that something we're trying to replicate with technology? Or is it better for us to reflect on if we could achieve what are we actually trying to achieve, and why? I don't know if I'm answering your question or if I've gone completely in the wrong direction.
Fine. I didn't ask about you answered about theoretical errors, maybe mistakes in learning theories, but I referred to interests of business forces, maybe government that try to compete in one in each other. Can you recognize those kinds of forces in the edtech sphere?
Certainly. I think all of those things are present in the edtech sphere, and particularly I think business interests and venture capitalism and larger technology companies seeking to break into the education sphere because they understand it to be a lucrative market with lots of consumers are all really present, and I think something we have to think really hard about. At the same time, those companies maybe are telling us something about how to scale up, how to reach the most people, how to appeal to people that we should be thinking about. So I to be honest, I haven't really thought that through, but you've given me something to really keep thinking about. So thank you.
Okay, well, our time is up. People need to go home to their kids or to have dinner. And Suraj, you need to wake up and go take a shower or start your
You
day,
need to
right?
wake up. Yeah, finally. Yeah.
It's pretty early there. Well, I guess not that early, but in any case, look, we genuinely appreciate the time. It was really an incredible talk. You taught us a lot, and you gave us a lot to think about on these. Okay, it's 11 o'clock there. I see your note. Okay, sorry. In any case, it was really wonderful to have you here. We benefit a lot. I think you got us started on the right foot, and you give us just a tremendous amount to think about. And so we'll carry on the conversation amongst ourselves. And again, thank you so much. Really, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. Have a great week.
Thanks.